Hello, everyone. This is number 13 in my ongoing series on interpretations of Bible prophecy through the ages. And today I want to introduce a new concept. I've touched on it briefly in some of the past videos. I'm calling it floating prophecies of the Hebrew Bible. So this is specifically the Hebrew Bible, primarily from what we call the Hebrew prophets, that is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, through the so-called minor prophets all the way to Malachi. So within those texts, and I will bring in a few other texts, perhaps from the Psalms especially, where you have this generic quality. I call it a floating prophecy. I've talked about how chronology can float down through history and dates can get assigned and predicted and reassigned and predicted with what appears to be, by and large, a 100% failure rate. But what about sections, that is, topical themes? In the previous episode of this series, number 12, I did talk about 5 great themes that come up in the Hebrew prophets. So if you didn't hear that one, you can go back and take a look at that. But in view of what's going on today, as I'm making this video in October of 2023, and the war that's going on in the Middle East with Israel and its various enemies, particularly Hamas, you're seeing on the internet all kinds of applications of what I call these floating prophecies. I can't cover them all, but I want to cover a few of them. And so let me share my screen. The way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to put them right up on the screen. I have a Bible program that I use. It's called Accordance. I think you can see those pretty well. This is from the book of Isaiah. I think you can see that, Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 4. And this is one of those I've covered before. But by way of introduction, let's take a look at it. It starts with a kind of identifying tag. It's Isaiah. He's son of Amos, his father, and it's concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now, it helps to know when one of these texts was written. And in this case, we do know that this is the prophet Isaiah. It's in the book that we call Isaiah, when the Assyrians were threatening the country before the Babylonians came down later on in the 6th century. So here you have in the 8th century, Isaiah prophesying, and he actually, in the first chapter, I can go back and show you, he identifies the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So if you know a little bit of the history of the different kings of Judah, that's easy to date and identify. But look, when you go to the prophecy, you suddenly get this, and it will come to pass in the latter days. Now, that term is used a number of ways in the Hebrew Bible. Sometimes it just means like afterward. It'll come to pass down the line. And there are many examples. I don't want to cover that right now. But literally, it is the days that are after, the coming days. So the reason latter days might not be a perfectly good translation in terms of the way it's used today in English is people talk about the last days in terms of just eschatology. And it probably does have more the meaning of, and then it will come to pass later. So that's why I call it a floating prophecy. When is later? There's no chronology. And it does seem to look far to the future. And it is a word in this case. Sometimes it's a vision, the word chason in Hebrew. So what do you see in the latter days or afterwards, later on in history from Isaiah's time? The mountain of the house of the Lord, and I'm just going to use Lord today because I'm using the Revised Standard Version. And whenever you see L-O-R-D, all caps, that's the word Jehovah or Yahweh, the sacred name in English and in Hebrew. So the mountain of the Lord will be established as the highest of the mountains and shall be raised above the hills, and all nations will flow to it. Now, this kind of geographic imagery is often used in the Hebrew Bible, where mountains are basically nations and kingdoms. And you can see that's the meaning here, because the prophecy is that the mountain of the Lord's house, presumably Jerusalem, would be exalted above all the mountains around that are like the nations. And then these nations flow up to Jerusalem, and many people shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion," Zion is another word for Jerusalem, "shall go forth the Torah," the law. It's the word Torah, "and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Now, here is a very interesting verse. It's really the dream of the United Nations. So if you go to the United Nations and you look in front of the main entrance with all the flags, and across the street there's the Isaiah wall with this verse actually quoted. And in the back of the United Nations, along the river, there's a statue that was erected by the Soviet Union that shows a male figure beating a sword into a plow, and the plow is kind of coming up out of the sword. And then underneath, a quote from Isaiah, and that was in the height of the Cold War. I think it was under Nikita Khrushchev. Well, if you keep reading, then it will switch to a more specific context, just like chapter 1 is in the days of Ahaz and Hezekiah and so forth. And this will take you back to the time of Isaiah for sure. But this I would call a floating prophecy. And by floating, it's this kind of portrait or idea of a future, an unspecified future of what is to come. So in terms of people trying to interpret Bible prophecy and do the kind of this is that thing, as people are doing all over the internet and YouTube and pulpits all over the country and all over the land, but particularly in America, because we have this huge prophecy movement among the evangelical Christians that I've discussed somewhat before. You've got all kinds of people trying to plug the events of the Hebrew prophets into the daily news, what's been going on since October 7th, and what's predicted to go on as they would present it, with that horrible attack by Hamas upon the Israeli population. So now let me go to another one that I think you'll find very interesting if you've never read it, and that is the book of Joel. And I'm going to get to chapter 3, but I want to point out something. The book of Joel is the floating prophet par excellence. Look at it. Do you see what king it was written under, whether of the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah? Nope. Any reference to a date or a time or a period? Nothing. All you have, the word of the Lord came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. So who is he? Now you can go into traditions, and particularly within Judaism, there are various traditions about all the prophets. But in terms of a historical reference, you just have the book of Joel. And then when it starts, notice, "Hear this, you aged men, give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your fathers? Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children another generation." Wow. What a beginning. Verse 2, after the introduction of Joel, that it's him, you get this thing about something that is happening that has never happened before, and in the days to come, it won't happen, subsequent generations. Now that's going to remind you of all kinds of things, but notice it's very generic. And then it begins to talk about different plagues, you might say. The cutting locust, the swarming locust, the hopping locust, destroying. And then telling people, "Awake, you drunkards, you drinkers of wine. A nation has come against my land. powerful and without number. Its teeth are lion's teeth. It has the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vines, splintered my fig trees, stripped off their bark and thrown it down. The branches are made white. Lament like a virgin girded in sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. In other words, a woman that's engaged whose bridegroom is killed and so forth. What about farmers? Be confounded, O tillers of the soil, wine dressers and so forth, all of these products. Gird on sackcloth and lament, sanctify a fast, call a solemn assembly. And then you get, alas, for the day of the Lord is near, as destruction from the Almighty it comes. And notice that word Almighty, which is Shaddai, is a very archaic and old way of referring to God. It's used mostly in books like Job. This term, the day of the Lord, is always a kind of a day of judgment. And then it begins to describe all the desolation of the crops and the grains, and a fire that's devouring before, and warfare, the sound of a trumpet. And notice, my holy mountain, which we just saw in Isaiah 2. So this is definitely trouble, seems to be Jerusalem, some kind of invasion of the land with all sorts of resulting devastation. Reminds me of what we've seen in Ukraine in the last few years, where crops are being ruined and so forth. And this could even be kind of like biblical plagues. But notice the language. For the day of the Lord is coming, it is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like blackness they're spread upon the mountains, a great and powerful people. And notice this, their like has never been of old, nor will ever be again after them through the years of all generations. Well, if you're reading that literally, right, and not just kind of, this is really going to be bad, then it has to be a final kind of battle, right? A final kind of invasion of the land of Israel by a final enemy. And so once again, we get to this floating problem with biblical chronology as well as biblical prophecies, is it's put here and the end is not yet because other things happen, or sometimes things even normalize, like 70 AD, such a crisis, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. But the 2nd century, other than the next revolt, once that's over, you've got the so-called good emperors of Rome with Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius and so forth, that are supposed to be the philosopher kings, and the Roman Empire, of course, continues. So what does it mean it'll be worse than ever before? We've already covered in the Gospels, Mark 13, the so-called Jesus apocalypse. He seems to refer to something like this, but I think he gets it from the book of Daniel. Well, did the book of Daniel get it from Joel, or did Joel get it from the book of Daniel, or some tradition that Daniel knows? And then it's described, fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but after them desolate wilderness, and nothing escapes them. And then it begins to describe the warriors and how they come. It's given in ancient languages with chariots and horses, but that doesn't stop anyone today from saying, well, the modern equivalent of a chariot is a Merkabah tank, Israeli name for the tank. And what does it mean, a chariot? And they leap on the tops of mountains and so forth. The people are in anguish. All the faces grow pale. The earth quakes. The sun and moon are darkened. The stars withdraw their shining. Now, because of prophecies like this, those who take Mark 13 as a prediction of 70 AD would say that this language applies to 70 AD because you don't take it really literally. And this is the very language that Jesus draws upon. In fact, most interpreters are agreed that Jesus is drawing the Mark 13 prophecies out of Daniel and out of the book of Joel. And you can see the very language used here. Also, there's a set of chapters in Isaiah that I'm going to cover in the next episode or two that are also these floating prophecies. So it sounds really specific, and yet as you go on, you're not sure. Now look at Joel 2:18. Then the Lord became jealous for his land. So first of all, it's describing an invasion, a devastation, an unprecedented time of trouble. But then God acts and becomes jealous for his land and pity on his people. And he begins to restore them and removes this northern invader away, right? You should rejoice and be glad, O sons of Zion, because he's going to begin to give you the early rain and the latter rain, and your threshing floors will be full and so forth. And you'll know I'm in the midst of Israel. But look at this. This is the challenge. And you will know that I'm in the midst of Israel, and that I, the Lord, am your God, and there is none else, and my people shall never again be put to shame. But once again, when you get those kinds of statements, it'll never be again like this. It's the worst ever in history. Or here, the people will never again be put to shame. Than any other time that people thought, surely this is it, starting with maybe the Babylonian invasion, the Assyrian invasion, and then you could get down to the Roman captivity. And then all through history down to our own times, you get interpretations of the fate of the city of Jerusalem. Notice this, Joel 2, verse 28, right at the end. And it will come to pass afterward, okay? In other words, that's actually the same idea. After, in the last days, but now it's in the days after what I just covered, that I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. And you get people prophesying and God speaking to people again and all kinds of signs in the heaven. And basically, it sounds like the end of the age. And that's why people who call themselves preterists are so confident that it was fulfilled in 70 AD, even if it doesn't sound like it. Like as you go on to read Joel 3, it doesn't seem to describe the Christian church. It talks about the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem in the land. And you have to go into this heavy, heavy allegorization to apply it to Christianity in some symbolic way. And when you get down to the details, it doesn't apply at all. So now we get down to chapter 3, and this is the chapter I wanted to really emphasize. 1 and 2 are kind of bring you into the picture. But look at chapter 3. And I've heard this just this week being used to predict what's going to happen in the future in Israel, with the war breaking out, Hezbollah in the north and Iran, and then the question of the loyalty of all the Arab countries surrounding Israel and what's going to really happen. And we've got all these people on the internet. And I just want to warn you about this kind of thing, because I think many people who follow me, they're certainly very sincerely interested in Bible prophecy. But remember, this series is Bible prophecy through the ages. I'd like to put up a sign: readers beware, readers be cautious, readers be careful. We always want to look at history, we want to look at language and so forth. But this is one of the most interesting texts that we could go to. And I want to continue this floating prophecy idea over the next few episodes, and we'll look at quite a few of these texts. So let's take a look at this one, Joel 3, verse 1. For behold, in those days and at that time. So see how it hooks back to the latter days when the Spirit is poured out, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. So it sounds like a kind of exile and return, maybe. But look at this. I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. That's the valley of God's judgment. Jehovah will judge. Many think it's the Kidron Valley. I think it's more symbolic. It could even be up north around Megiddo, where we get our name Armageddon, the valley of Megiddo. Notice, so all nations are going to come. Does that mean all the nations will gather against Jerusalem? And what does all mean? And I will enter into judgment with them on account of my people and my heritage Israel. So in this text, God is now punishing the nations that took Israel into exile. But when is this? if you're talking about Judah and Jerusalem, then that would be in the 6th century BC with the Babylonians and the Persians. But then the Greeks come in and the Romans come in, right? And the Byzantine Christians come in and the Muslims come in and the Ottoman Empire finally, which is also Muslim, and then the British and so forth and so on. So how do you read these? I mean, most scholars would put this probably as Babylon. But let's look. Why is God going to enter into judgment with these nations? Because they've scattered them among the nations and divided up my land, and have cast lots for my people, and given a boy for a harlot, and sold a girl for wine, and have drunk it. Does that sound like people being abducted or put into slavery? Well, the Babylonians did that. The Assyrians did that. The Romans did that. And all the other conquerors. But then it gets really specific. And I was listening to a bunch of YouTube videos this week to prepare for this, to see what I could find. They're easy to find. And notice, what are you to me, O Tyre and Sidon? That's Lebanon today. And all the regions of Philistia. Wow, that's where we get the word Palestine. Are you paying me back for something? If you're paying me back, I will requite your deed upon your own head swiftly and speedily. For you've taken my silver and my gold and carried my rich treasures into your temples. Well, see, that kind of thing does fit ancient Babylon. I don't think it fits much the situation today, not in any literal way, unless temple suddenly becomes bank accounts or something. You've sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks and removing them far from their own border. Well, is that going all the way back to the time of the Romans and the Greeks? Or is it different aspects of the exile in the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the other prophets we know about? But I will stir them up from the place which you've sold them, and I'll requite your deed upon your own head. And I will sell your sons and daughters into the hands of the sons of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabians, to a nation far off. And then you have war proclaimed. And look at this, the opposite of what we just read in Isaiah 2. Let all the men of war draw near, let them come up, beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I'm a warrior. Sounds like a people's army. And notice, hasten and come, all you nations round about. Gather yourselves there. Bring down your warriors, O Lord. Let the nations bestir themselves. Come into the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will sit to judge all the nations. Well, you see how people would read this and say, well, this is the final judgment. This is what people talk about in the book of Revelation. In fact, this is quoted in the book of Revelation. In the latter chapters, as you go to 17, 18, 19, before you get to the so-called millennium. This is also quoted in the book of Revelation. Put in the sickle, the harvest is ripe. And it's described as a kind of a worldwide phenomena, which never fit the ancient world. I suppose it's the world of that day, but the language is very extravagant, isn't it? Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. And then you've got the heavenly signs again. The sun and the moon are darkened. The stars withdraw their shining. And the Lord roars from Zion. The heavens and the earth shake. And he becomes a refuge to his people. Now here, if you take the so-called preterist reading of these texts and say this was all basically in the time of Jesus leading up to 70 AD, and that all of this is now fulfilled, it really breaks down if you read it, not even hyper literally, but just in terms of a set of ideas, because none of these things have really happened, okay? So let's take a look. So you will know that I'm the Lord your God who dwell in Zion, my holy mountain, and Jerusalem shall be holy, and strangers shall never pass through it again. That was 70 AD. Strangers didn't pass through Jerusalem. Now, what you have to do then is say, oh, well, it's not Jerusalem on earth, it's the heavenly Jerusalem. as if there is a heavenly Jerusalem. You only find that in the Apostle Paul and certain other texts, the book of Hebrews. This is a later Hellenistic, dualistic idea. Then you get the mountains dripping with sweet wine. The hills shall flow with milk. The stream beds of Judah will flow with water. A fountain shall come forth from the house of the Lord and water the valley of Shittim. But notice this, Egypt shall become a desolation and Edom a desolate wilderness for violence done to the people of Judah. Well, the modern state of Israel has made peace with Egypt. Now, interpreters today are saying that is going to break into a war. And you see how they're predicting these things so that people are beginning to think, I think this is very dangerous. Well, probably Israel will attack Egypt and desolate them. And Edom is basically Jordan, right across from the Dead Sea and so forth and down south. But Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem to all generations. And I will avenge their blood and will not clear the guilty, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So that's the last verse. Jerusalem inhabited forever. So here's what happens. There are three ways to go with this. One is to say it all happened. Everything I just read you happened, and it happened right after the time of Jesus, and it was all fulfilled in an allegorical way. And the argument for that is that in the New Testament, these verses are quoted and applied to their own day. This generation will not pass till all these things are fulfilled. So either the Bible's wrong or Jesus is wrong in Mark 13, if he ever said that, or Joel is wrong, somebody's wrong, because any normal average reading of this does not seem to fit. Well, I have no doubt that the people who wrote Mark 13 and the traditions of the book of Revelation and all the authors of the early Jesus movement who were highly apocalyptic did think it was going to happen in their own day. Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, I've come to gather the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that's what this is predicting. There are many prophecies about that. That's one of the great themes of the Hebrew prophets, that all of the Israelites of all the 12 tribes will come back. And Jesus appoints 12 apostles to rule over the regathered 12 tribes. We also have seen that in Isaiah 11. So that's one way to go, just to say, well, it all happened, the Bible's true, and so forth. Now, many average readers of the Bible can't go with that, even if it is applied sometimes in the New Testament, seemingly to the Roman period of the 1st century CE. And so you have the dispensationalists, as they're usually called, who begin to, sometimes called the futurists, who say, no, 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 this is all going to happen again, you see? And so the reason it becomes floating is each time there's a crisis with the Jews, or in our own day for the last 75 years or so, there's been a state of Israel that you could begin reading this and applying it to, or however it would apply, it's going to be the future. And why does it have to be the future? Because it has to be the worst time ever. Remember when we went through the text in Daniel? It's going to be a time of trouble, unprecedented in all of human history. And you've sort of got that language here in the book of Joel. And Joel is the most apocalyptic book in this regard, next to the book of Daniel. If you take the book of Daniel, which is primary, and the book of Joel, and you take the sections of Isaiah I'm going to cover, 24 through 27, you begin to see, you might say, the nuts and bolts of this ancient apocalyptic system. So I think that's enough for a start. I'm going to stop the share. And in the next episode, number 14, I'm going to take some more floating prophecies. And I think I'm going to go to some really tough ones. I'm going to go to the book of Zechariah. In the book of Zechariah, particularly towards the end, you have what are called oracles. Okay, we know the word oracle in English. Remember, the Greeks had the oracle at Delphi. But it really means the prophetic burden. It's literally the heavy thing that the prophet has to deliver to the people. It's that kind of idea. Oracle to me is not a very good translation. The burden, and the King James actually put burden because it tends to be a literal translation. So what you have in chapter 9, 10, and 11, and if you want to treat this kind of like a class, do a little prep. If you're following this, study those chapters. Zechariah 9, 10, and 11 is one of those burdens of whoever wrote Zechariah. Maybe somebody named Zechariah, because it means the Lord remembers. So it doesn't have to be somebody's name, but I think it is somebody with that name, probably living in the 6th century BC. That seems to be the way it's dated. And then in 12 and 13, you've got another burden delivered or message delivered. And then in chapter 14, a final finale, you might say. Now, when we get to chapter 14, I hope that's not a floating prophecy. I can tell you this, it's never happened before. Things like it have happened, but nothing fits it. And it will illustrate exactly what I'm talking about, because it has to do with this idea of this is it, this is terminal, this is final, it's over. And that's what people, of course, call the end of the age. So I'll close this now. You've got a good snippet to look at. You can go back and read the 3 chapters of Joel and think about some of the things I've covered. And as I close, just caution, 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 flashing lights down the highway as you drive the prophecy road, please, because the internet is just full of things about the Antichrist and what's going to happen and all kinds of predictions. It's mostly Christians, but guess what? Quite a few Jewish interpreters are getting into this. They come to it in a very different way because they also draw from all sorts of mystical and Kabbalistic traditions, and in some cases, living words of some of their rabbis and teachers that talk about the wars of Gog and Magog and so forth. We can't possibly cover everything everybody's saying from all quarters, but we'll try to hit some of the parameters and explore these multiple ways that people interpret things. Okay, take care.